You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
I moved into so-called venture building, which was essentially building startups again and again and again up to a certain point and then letting them go. Our focus isn't on empowering and supporting individual startups or startup founders, but rather on empowering individuals who see themselves contributing or plugging into the investment side of that equation. We provide rigorous remote programs for aspiring and emerging African investors and ecosystem builders. But then when I came to Nigeria, I was like, wow, this is literally home. Because I would argue that it's much more difficult to be a VC in Nigeria than it is to be a VC in London.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have another special guest, Mark Kleyner, who is co-founder and program director of Dream VC, which is an investor accelerator for Africa. Through their community-driven educational program, they run highly selective remote programs on venture capital and the innovation ecosystem across Africa's startup ecosystem. Welcome to the podcast, Mark. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me here, Tessa. A pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I'm not sure if you've listened to the podcast before.
Yes, I'm a regular listener, actually. I think I'm a fan that's now turning into a guest.
Oh, brilliant. That's great to hear. Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. So you'll know that I usually like to start from the beginning. So if you could please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about Mark Kleyner.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, welcome to all the listeners as well. On my end, I am Mark. I'm the co-founder of Dream VC. I'm also a startup angel, a startup advisor, and on occasion, a VC fund advisor too. Previously, I've been a consultant, and I've had the pleasure, or perhaps the challenge, of working with a number of global VC funds and venture-backed startups across the UK, Europe, US, Southeast Asia, and more recently across the African continent. Now I'm really focused 100% on what's going on in Africa, specifically in the innovation and tech funding ecosystem. But, I've had a pretty weird and interesting career path, having lived and worked in over 25 countries over the last 10 years. So definitely happy to elaborate on that and dive deeper in the conversation ahead.
Fantastic. So you've given us a great snapshot into who you are and your career path. Worked and lived across 25 countries, which is pretty impressive. What an achievement. So, as we mentioned in the intro, you're co-founder and program director of Dream VC. So, tell us a bit more about the company and the work that you're currently doing in Africa.
Yes, of course. And thanks for bringing it up. I think the first point I need to start with as a quick clarification is for some of the listeners out there, that Dream VC, despite our naming, is not a standard VC fund or syndicate or even a fund of funds. Instead, we are a pretty unique type of company. We call ourselves an investor accelerator for Africa. And what does that mean? Well, it means that our focus isn't on empowering and supporting individual startups or startup founders, but rather on empowering individuals who see themselves contributing or plugging into the investment side of that equation. We provide rigorous remote programs for aspiring and emerging African investors and ecosystem builders who are pretty keen on upskilling in any way in the VC scene anywhere on the continent. We do this through running highly selective, remote, cohort-based programs, which we run every year. And these are delivered essentially online, enabling us to have an online, but nonetheless highly exclusive community. We tend to focus on training working professionals, though we don't have a prerequisite for any period or point in your life. Instead, we tend to group people together by the so-called life arena they find themselves in. Are they somebody who wants to break into the venture capital world, maybe secure a junior role like an analyst and associate? We have a program for that. That's called the Launch into VC program. Are they somebody who's a bit more senior, has more experience, perhaps is already in the VC space or is a manager or director in some other capacity, a super connector, or somebody with as many or as wide of a network as yourself, well, then, we'd definitely say the Invest the Accelerator program, our flagship and much more serious one, is a better fit for that. And I'd say we've not been around for that long, but we're already seeing a pretty quick impact or turnaround on that impact. Since just 2021, we've trained about 90 fellows. They're spread across almost 30 African countries, and many of them have gone on to do amazing things, starting up new angel networks, launching pre-seed startup syndicate, joining African-focused VC funds like Lateral Frontiers, Capria Ventures, Ajim Capital, and many, many others. Yeah, that's what we do in a nutshell.
Awesome. So you've given us a comprehensive kind of overview of Dream VC and the programs that you're running currently in Africa. Earlier on, you mentioned that you've lived and worked across 25 different countries, but Dream VC isn't your first kind of foray or venture in Africa. So I was hoping you could tell us a bit more about your journey in Africa leading up to what you're currently doing with Dream VC.
Yeah, I think it's a good as place as any to start. And to be honest, it's a common question we get asked. How do I find myself someone who's Russian Ukrainian by birth, who'd gone and studied up in the UK and who'd lived all over the world, somehow focused on Africa?
Yes.
I think my very first experience to African markets actually came a bit unofficially. I'd been working in the US and in the UK, and I'd built a couple of founder friends who are among the West African diaspora, predominantly Ghanaian Americans, Nigerian British, who are based either in Europe or in the US, but who had various ideas about building something back on the continent, like a Revolut for Africa, or a Shopify for Africa, or a Wix for Africa, or something to that end. And many of them knew that I, by that point, had already worked at several venture-backed startups and in the VC space. So they would come to me and ask for general advice. How do you build a data room? How do you work out a business model? How do you build a business plan in the first case? What are investors? How do you deal with them? So I'd be helping them on the side. And it got me interested. It got me thinking, it's interesting that there are people, in a completely different market, but they don't want to build something in the UK or in the US. They want to go back and build something back home. That kind of stayed as the only engagement I had for 1 or 2 years while I was still very much full-time plugged into the consulting and venture world outside of the continent. But then an opportunity came up. I was working underneath the former CEO of Foodpanda, a last-mile logistics giant in East Asia. And I'd come to realize that Foodpanda and many other firms in the consumer and convenience spaces hadn't been built organically. They weren't the typical 18 or 40-year-old founder who uses the skill set, builds a team, rapidly works from 0 to 100. Instead, this was a type of startup that had been built within a so-called venture studio. I didn't understand that at the time, but as I'd come to understand, those were startup factories, essentially innovation hubs that would focus a lot of resources on building startups. So I wanted to learn more. I dove into that, and I kind of put one foot into the VC space in that sense. I moved into so-called venture building, which was essentially building startups again and again and again up to a certain point and then letting them go. And I really enjoyed that. I think for me, the whole adrenaline, the rush of growth and the rush of putting out fires, but also growing at any cost, that was really exciting. And that actually led me to work within this very large European venture studio, which had come to be known in Africa for having been the venture studio to launch Jumia, the Nigerian and since that point West African giant. And we're not talking about just Jumia logistics. We're talking about Jumia Food, Jumia Pay, Jumia Deals, Jumia Travel. The entire network of Jumia Group had come together inorganically. It had been built not by 1 or 2 guys sitting in a basement, but by 1,000 people systematically gathered from all across the world, experienced builders and operators, both Africans among the diaspora, as well as international talent, who had essentially been flown to Nigeria, to Ghana, or to Côte d'Ivoire, among some of the early markets, to put this together. And working underneath this guy who was now former head of growth, it was really, really exciting because I'd always grown just in my own methods, essentially using what I'd seen and trying to be scrappy and trying to save money where possible. But I'd never realized how growth can really work when you work with growth databases, growth dashboards, when you actually have a metrics-driven approach and you have a lot of resources to work. So you're a startup, but almost with a corporate style mentality.
Yes.
And that was really, really exciting to me for many reasons. But beyond just the professional side, it was exciting for me because as someone who'd grown up in Eastern Europe, I'd never felt any connection to living or working in Europe, living or working in the UK, in the US, Singapore, and many other countries I've come to work over the years. But then when I came to Nigeria, I was like, wow, this is literally home, right? It just has better weather and better food. But the same problems, infrastructural issues, massive issue of brain drain, a complete focus on just a couple of career goals, most parents having a lot of pressure on their children, a complete change over one or two generations of societal behavior, digital adoption, all these things that perhaps to someone who moves to Africa from Europe or the US seem like strange phenomena, to me seemed like I was just going back home. This was the same things I'd seen the ecosystem develop and face and essentially try and overcome in Eastern Europe. But what was exciting to me was that unlike the Eastern European market, where most founders would define success as just leaving and going off to live in the US or in the UK or in Dubai or in Europe, there were many, many African founders, even some of my early friends, who were coming back to work on the continent full time, or who would shuttle between the continent and Europe, the continent of Hong Kong, continent and China, and try and build something out. Keen to essentially bring some technological innovation and then tailor that to the African reality. So that to me made me think, I 100% want to be involved. And since that point, that was about 2017, 2018, I've essentially done as much as possible to make sure at least 50% of my time was focused on Africa. First, this came in the form of joining several mentorship networks. I've come to mentor for Impact Hub in Africa, Seed Stars, Founder Institute, and various other networks. And then very quickly, that turned into a full-time role. I took on the role as co-CEO at an impact accelerator set up from Uganda that had a Pan-African focus and ran that for about 2 years. We worked with more than 24 startups, and almost all of them are alive today, with about 15 or 16 of them going on to raise VC funding and multiple going on to raise funding from some of the best accelerators in the world, such as Y Combinator or Techstars, validating our approach to helping them build and really scale beyond just their home market. And in that process, I guess I realized, and this really comes to where we are today, I realized that a lot of people were saying that they want to be supporting startups. There's so many people that were saying, let's support startups, let's support innovation. I was seeing a lot of professionals express this, but very few people were actually writing checks. And I was speaking to more and more founders, and there was a very confusing dystopia where many, especially Nigerian founders, would have to go outside of Nigeria to the US or to Europe to get the very first angel in before local angels who actually understood their market would put any money into that deal. And that is just such a crazy notion that you have to literally go to a different continent to get somebody to believe in your idea, because local investors often weren't as eager to really take a bet on that visionary.
Very true.
And that was the case with so many young African founders that I thought, why is that happening? And we came to realize that most individuals who are somehow affiliated with the startup space in Africa, at least until the last few years, haven't been writing checks. They haven't been actually investing. They haven't been thinking about how they can put their money to work. And we started trying to fix that. And that's how Dream VC really came about, to essentially make it much, much easier for individuals to get involved in whatever way they see fit, as a venture capital professional, as an angel investor, as a VC lawyer, to really understand how the VC market works and to make sure that the caliber and standard of African VC isn't something to be laughed at in the US or in Europe, but is equally, if not even more competitive. Because I would argue that it's much more difficult to be a VC in Nigeria than it is to be a VC in London. It's much more difficult to be a Ghanaian VC than it is to be an American one. And I actually have a lot of respect for people who, despite a lower paycheck, much more difficult markets, still really, really believe in what they do and really put their role together. And that's who we want to help. That's what Dream VC is all about.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that great insight and your journey into the Africa VC and startup space. I guess it's quite clear that you fully embedded yourself in the African startup space as Dream VC. It's a very unique concept in the Africa space because it's an accelerator for investors and not startups, which is what you typically do see in the Africa space. Part of your ambition is to, I guess it's a very bold ambition, is to accelerate the next generation of ecosystem building African investors. Can you kind of break that down and explain to us what your approach to achieving this is?
Yeah, and I think we often fall into the same trap as others of giving these broad, sweeping statements of let's build the ecosystem together, but what is actually... No, I get it. I mean, I think for us, when we say we want to accelerate the next generation of ecosystem builders or African investors more widely, I think it really comes down to infrastructure. And let me explain what I mean by that. So I think I've said before, and we mentioned this even in private conversations, that I believe that African startup ecosystems suffer from infrastructure issues, whether it's payments issues, transport issues, storage issues, or things like this. But I believe the African investment ecosystem suffer from these as well, except there's a certain element of pride or perhaps an element of non-transparency, which means that investors don't actually showcase their issues to the world. Everybody knows that startups are going to struggle with funding. Everybody knows if you're trying to get from point A to point B in Dar es Salaam or in Kampala or in Lagos, it's going to be quite a hefty challenge just to get through traffic. Everybody knows structural issues with energy, for example, in South Africa. But for some reason, most people don't know that most investors actually really struggle to do what they're doing. Why is that? Well, for the first, most African startup hubs are disconnected. Investor visibility is limited. Due diligence is really expensive, and it's actually really hard to set up a VC fund or expand into a new African market, not because it's just difficult to raise, but because it's often actually hard to find great talent. I know I'm not going to name drop here, but a whole range of tier 1 or even tier 2 African funds that ended up spending between 6 and 10,000 USD just to bring in talent from the US, from Europe, or from Asia, even when you can find the same great talent locally, if they just had the necessary maybe intellectual or social capital to connect to that fund. So I'm really a strong believer that that needs to change. And that's what really stands at the goal of this new generational kind of approach. If we want to see more equitable and more substantial funding to Africa, it needs to make it much easier for there to be a lot more players, a lot more stakeholders in the African innovation ecosystem. We need to make it a lot easier to hire, easier to find great talent, and easier for aspiring VCs, angels, and builders in any African country to get started. It's actually quite crazy to think that there are entire countries in Africa today with no tracked angel activity at all. No networks, no accelerators, no proper venture studios and funds. And we believe we can change these things by building a pretty strong, robust network of individuals who then in their own right act almost as change agents. They build up the ecosystem around them. They spread that knowledge beyond just the Dream VC community. They draw more domestic and international funding towards the tech and startup ecosystem. And they activate that societal interest. What is innovation really about? How can I contribute? Whatever they end up doing. So that's really at the core of this ambition, essentially creating more individuals who go out there, and they don't even need to be based on the continent. Just need to have some connection or long-term interest in the continent's growth, who are out there essentially reframing that African narrative away from how poor Africa is and how many challenges it has to what is the opportunity if there's a lot of collaboration and private public sector partnerships out there to actually build the innovation ecosystem.
So you've detailed, I guess, the infrastructure issues, transparency issues, and the difficulty setting up funds and recruiting the right talent. So from your personal journey with Dream VC, how has the journey been so far? How close are you to achieving this ambition of accelerating the next generation of ecosystem building African investors?
Well, I'd say we're really just getting started. I think everyone knows that demographics is certainly one point where most African countries have a very positive future. Much more so than India or China or any other market, which will no doubt face a demographic crisis in the next 50 years. And for us, the journey has really been quite amazing. I mean, as I've mentioned, I think privately and as we put out in the news, we've had over 2,300 applications over the past 2 years that we've run our programs. And that's really been amazing because this has come from no marketing budget. And I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. If you look at data on, for example, let's say the US, the Center for Venture Research, which is an organization that annually tracks investment activity into startups, actually estimated that there were about 360 to about 365,000 individuals who are active US-based angel investors last year. What does that mean? That means that there's 360,000 plus individuals who are investing in more than one company every year as of last year, alive today. And actually, the number of investments that they've made is somewhere close to 70,000. Now, that's one country, that's the US. Let's compare that to what we see across the entire continent, 54, 55 African countries, depending on who you ask. Well, today, there's only about 1,000 people writing any checks, and most of them don't even write one every single year, focused on African markets. A whole range of them are outside of the continent, not actually based locally. And this also impacts the number of startups that even make it to the stage when VC funds can fund them. When it comes to VC space is also too small. I mean, we say how we want to build more people into the profession of venture capital, how we want to make sure that more funds are launched, more funds are focused and based on Africa. Well, the number of funds alive today that are actually African focused is very small. I can come up with a list of funds based out of New York or San Francisco or London, for example, singular private companies who control more money than the entire African venture capital sector alive, as of the moment I'm speaking. So as far as I'm concerned, there's still a really long way to go. If we really want to have, a disruptive effect on the ecosystem, if we really want to make sure that our graduates out there setting a standard for transparency, setting a standard for being founder friendly, for being informed investors and affecting the ecosystem around them, I think, realistically, there needs to be several times more angels out there, several times more funds actually operating with an African focus. And I think that's going to take at least a couple more years.
Interesting. You mentioned there that you're just getting started. There is a long way to go. And you've received over 2,000 applications with limited marketing?
Yeah, over 2,300 even, just the last 2 years. But let's see how this year goes.
That's very impressive. I mean, from my personal observation, one thing I've observed is that a lot of your fellows are mostly of African descent. Was this intentional?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've been building a very intentional African-focused brand. After all, as we say, we are an investor accelerator for Africa, and all the content we develop tends to be predominantly African-focused. So yes, there are some things that are theoretically applicable anywhere, and especially if you're someone from an emerging market who faces particular difficulties, such as parts of India, parts of South America, the content could still be relevant. But despite that, it's still very, very much African focused. And the branding and everything we do around our community is very much African focused too. We talk a lot about the benefits of Pan-African cooperations, collaborations, and more of these kind of stuff. I think that message tends to echo much better with passionate Africans and Africans in the diaspora, more so than perhaps other ethnicities. That doesn't mean that we are actively being discriminatory. The programs are open for anyone to apply to. We don't favor a particular nationality. We don't favor ethnicities, and it doesn't have any effect on someone applying. But we always stress in all the applications we run, what really motivates you? What do you see yourself bringing to the startup or investor landscape in Africa, and why African VC? And I think just logically, it's easier to answer those questions if you have a personal passion with something going on the continent. So I think as a result, we've seen about 90 to 93, 94% of all of our fellows to date being African, or at least of partial African descent.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I guess leading on from this, what do you think is the importance of having Africans who have the right skills and training to invest in African startups?
Well, it really comes back to this sentiment I mentioned earlier of a self-sufficient or strong and sustainable private sector, and how that has to be domestically driven. It might look today like giant private sector firms dominate the VC space in London and UK, in the US, Canada, even in China. But when these markets were first growing, it was often government involvement and public-private sector collaborations that really started up the startup ecosystem. I just want to contribute, or have us contribute, to a future where there are many amazing African professionals out there who are actually heading up these investment firms, who are actually heading up any kind of development firms, and who are supporting, running, leading, and investing in African startups. And I think if that's not predominantly an African-led market, investing in Africans, then there's a certain disconnect there in terms of the long-term vision. And there's a risk where success stories such as amazing startups like Paystack and Flutterwave mean that someone gets wealth in San Francisco, someone gets wealthy in London, but not perhaps back home in Nigeria, in Ghana, or wherever might be more appropriate. So I think to have that cyclical effect where individuals invest, they see a great outcome, and that money goes back into the innovation ecosystem again, it's really important that there are many, many individuals who are African, who are connected to the ecosystem, both culturally, ethnically, and with a long-term interest, who are then sitting on the investment side too. And at the moment, unfortunately, it's not yet the case.
So you've detailed the importance of Africans who are investing in the African startup space, having the right skills and training, which is something that you provide at Dream VC. So from the work you're doing, being embedded in that space, what is the current state of education and training for African-focused startup investors?
Well, the current state. Well, if you imagine a farm and you imagine you've planted a seed and you're waiting on that seed, we are about 3 months before harvest season.
Okay.
It's definitely very, very, very early. And it's certainly a problematic space, that's for sure. I'd say from the fund managers we know and regularly speak to, upwards of 70 or 80 African focused funds have mentioned in the past how frustratingly little understanding or knowledge there is from mentors, advisors, co-investors, high net worth individuals, family offices, and even institutions on the continent about investing in African startups. There's a lot of disinformation, non-regionally specific information out there, and that's not been as helpful as it really could be. I mean, at the same time, obviously, we're taking a direct stab at the problem. We have this African-focused investor training programs, and obviously they're getting a lot of demand, which is great. And there are other initiatives out there too, but specifically either targeting emerging managers, such as those run by the IFC and the UN, the Aspen Center as well, a few dedicated angel investing courses and programs, even out of the UK and the US, that can help individuals get started. I think the challenge is that sometimes programs like this don't always appreciate how difficult it is to solve even basic problems before we get to, what kind of term sheet or fundraising terms are we talking about. Figuring out how to get access to FX in Nigeria or Ghana, for instance, is something that I don't think is taught in the business school, but it's something that we would discuss as a realistic challenge for startups and entrepreneurs. And we believe there's a lot more to be done. So hopefully as we scale up, so will other initiatives, and more of them will become more hands-on, focusing on the realities of doing business in Africa as well, so that those intellectual barriers to entry to the investment space that currently exist and which are currently still really high, gradually, slowly but surely decrease, and then the space will be actually worth talking about. But right now, I think the state of training for African-focused investors, well, it's very, very early.
You've mentioned there that we're still at the early stages of education and training for African-focused startup investors. There's still a lot more to be done. Early days. I guess from a skills and knowledge perspective, how do African startup investors compare to their global counterparts?
Well, I think this is actually a really interesting question because there's a difference in how I'd answer this if we were talking about angels and how I'd answer this if we're talking about VCs. On the angel side, most of the African angels I've come across are more opportunistic.
Okay.
They are either somebody who's come into wealth from simply earning this money just in this generation. They're usually not individuals of inherited wealth backgrounds. And they're investing in things because they can relate to them. They were a small business owner before. They can see a small business owner in the network and they invest them. They're not actively out there sourcing for deals and engaging as a so-called super angel. At least not many of them, as is more common in the US or more well-capitalized market. So on the angel side, I think from a skills and knowledge perspective, quite often they have great knowledge of the local market from where they're in, but very poor knowledge of other markets across Africa and not a really great track record of actually writing angel checks across the continent. Now, that's a sweeping statement. There's obviously individuals who are amazing at their angel activities, and there's been a couple of people who've been consistent even since the early 2000s, who are some of the most prolific angels out there today. Raj, for example, from Denton's, who's been quite active in investing through his private investment firm, or say Tommy Davis, who is now one of the co-founders of ABAN. But I think beyond this, if we focus on African VC funds, it's a completely different story. I have a whole bunch of friends, and so does my co-founder and our whole community has great ties with African VC funds. And what we see is that on average, a individual working for an African VC fund as an analyst, an associate, or principal is sometimes, or even more often, better than some of their global counterparts. On an individual level, this is explained by the fact that there are so few roles and there are so few African VC funds out there today. So when those funds start to hire, and when they approach hiring as we only need 1 or 2 or 3 people, so we need to get the best people out there, the requirements that African VC funds set for talent is often much higher than the requirements actually in a fund, for example, in the US or in Europe. We're talking about 5 to 10 years professional experience, even for junior roles. And what this means is that African VC teams sometimes end up being almost overqualified. At the
Okay.
same time, on a wider level, they're still not on a fair or equal playing field with international funds. So from a skills and knowledge basis, they're overqualified. But from a money basis, these funds are managing, on average, a fund size 10 times smaller than a Western or East Asian comparable fund, which means that they're paying, being paid a lot less, but being expected to be a lot more competent. So you can see how there's a bit of a weird market situation today, and it's not a bad thing. It does mean that African VC funds in general know what they're doing, but it does suggest that there need to be more ways for individuals from a non-standard, 10-year PE background, former banking background to break into the VC space. And I think one of the reasons that African VC funds set such high standards, and PE funds as well, set such high standards for entry, is because they just don't have the resources to train individuals who enter those firms. They're so lean and so overstretched already that they need you to be competent going into those firms. And that's why, it's really important that there are programs that help them, or activities that help them upskill even outside before they enter the market, so that when they're applying for these roles, they already have that skill set, even if they don't bring 5 or 10 years to the table.
Thank you for that, Mark. So you've detailed the skills and knowledge capabilities of angel and VCs in Africa from a skills and knowledge perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So if we look at it by locality, we know that funding in the Africa startup space seems to be centralized around the 4 big markets: Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, and South Africa. Are you seeing this mirrored in terms of people applying for your programs? Do you see a huge concentration within those 4 markets?
We actually don't. And, we actually haven't had many applicants from North Africa at all. And to an extent, that's not necessarily an accident or a coincidence. So both for myself and my co-founder, our networks have always been predominantly West Africa. That's where we both started in our activities on the continent. And we've spent most of the African parts of our careers working with startups, founders, investors, and ecosystem players in West African countries, such as Ghana, such as Nigeria, and others. And I think Nigeria specifically does punch above its weight anyway, whether it's through Nigerian tech Twitter, the Nigerian tech media community, the vibrant international Nigerian diaspora community. If you look at the fellows today, they're spread across close to 30 countries, as I mentioned, but a good 40 to 50% of all of our current fellow base are Nigerian, and that reflects the application pool. I said 2,300 applicants. Well, at least more than 1,000 came from Nigerians, whether Nigerians in Nigeria, Nigerians in the diaspora who Japad or gone abroad. I think we definitely see a couple of Kenyans there and a number of South African fellows. I think they're among the second and third most popular countries we see applicants from. But we don't see many people from Egypt, and I think it speaks to a information divide between what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa and what's going on in the North African countries. I would also point to the fact that the African startup space tends to describe a deal as Nigerian, even if it's built by a Nigerian guy sitting in the US, or a deal as Kenyan, even if it's built by a Kenyan sitting in the US. And what you quite often see is we have individuals in the diaspora who perhaps are Nigerian or Kenyan or South African, but who, are also perhaps half something else. They're half Ghanaian, or they're half Tanzanian,
yes,
or they're half Rwandan, for example. So we don't always have the same classification of how we classify people roughly by where they're from as, startups are defined. But broadly speaking, we have a lot more applicants from the West, Central, and East African belt than we do from North Africa.
Fantastic. Thank you. So you've detailed that a lot of your network is in Nigeria, but you receive applications from over 30 different markets within Africa.
We receive applications from even more. I think It's just that we've had fellows who are actually made it onto the programs who are spread across 30 different countries.
Okay. Fantastic. So with that in mind, who is the dream VC ideal candidate, and how do you go about selecting who is suitable for the program?
$1 million question, isn't it? Well, let me think what I can disclose without, making it too easy for individuals keen on applying to our future programs.
Please do.
As things stand, we have 2 programs that we run every year. And there are 2 groups of so-called, I guess, as you call them, ideal candidates that fit them. And I'd say ideal with an asterisk here, because we aren't really looking for just one key background, since it's really at our core identity as a community that there's people who come from all different walks of life who could be an amazing asset to the VC space. I certainly didn't have a financial background, and neither did my co-founder, even though that's a stereotype for our VC world. That being said, for the launch into VC program, the one that's really more skills-based, we usually look for working professionals who are keen to break into junior roles in VC. The program, as I mentioned, is more driven around what skills you can build, and it lends itself well to individuals who maybe bring a couple of years of professional experience to the table, who are postgrad students, who perhaps have gone through an MBA or are going through one now, who have some digital skills, former operators, especially from the business development, marketing, sales, software engineering, or media space. We've even had a couple of founders go through the Launch into VC program, leveraging that to either better understand how to deal with VCs or to start investing on the side as an angel or operator investor. For our flagship Investor Accelerator program, the target audience or the ideal candidate is a bit different. The program in itself is much broader, much more comprehensive, and touches on topics that tend to be more appropriate to someone a bit later on in their career. For people who are looking to launch something in the ecosystem, a new fund, a new accelerator, a new innovation hub, or for individuals who just want to upskill themselves further on topics that are usually locked behind closed doors or years of experience. So we're talking about senior operators, managers, directors, aspiring fund managers, existing investors, somebody both in or out of the space who already has a couple of years of professional experience. Usually we're looking at people who have at least more than 5 years of professional experience working full-time at a corporate, at another organization, who've understood how to work within big different teams in different markets. And now they have that useful skill set, but maybe they don't have the same or equivalent skill set in the venture world. So the starting knowledge level of general life skills or sector-specific skills is much higher. And quite often, these individuals are also better positioned to even put their own money to work as angel investors or investing alongside deals than the typical LIVC fellow. So again, I'd say for somebody who maybe brings perhaps under 5 years of professional experience, who is looking for a role in VC, who wants really to get the skills-based training out of this, I would say the Launch into VC program is a better choice. But for those who really want to build something, who want to build their brand, build their network, launch a new initiative in the market, and who maybe have more experience or more funds of their own to support their vision, then definitely I'd say the Investor Accelerator program is a better fit for them at Dream VC.
Awesome. So you've given us great insights into the ideal, or maybe I should use suitable candidate, also the program structure and what value that adds to students or fellows, as you call them. Once people have accessed, completed the program, can you tell us about some of the success stories that you've had so far? For example, fellows who have completed your program and have gone on to achieve big things, make huge impact in the Africa VC space?
Oh, yes. I mean, I wouldn't know who to choose.
Brilliant.
There's so many. But, and even on the earlier point, I would definitely say that there is still a difference of the length of these programs and how they influence the future success stories of the fellows. I think something I didn't mention is our Launch into VC programs, these junior ones, they tend to run for about 3 to 4 months. And it means you're getting about 12 weeks of VC content, whereas the Senior Investor Accelerator programs run for closer to 5 months. They're both remote. They're both designed to be completed by someone who's a full-time working professional somewhere else. So it doesn't mean that it's infinitely more intensive, thing like that. But I would mention that as a result, people who go through the 3-month program are usually aiming to do something either with their own startup or to break into a VC role. And someone who goes through the 5-month program is looking to launch something new because they have that additional time to build better social networks, connect with players, and understand the nuances of doing it. So with that being said, I think that's given me enough time to think of a couple of examples. And for any of our fellows listening to this in the future, I promise this is not favoritism. I'm just being put on the spot. So I'm just going to come up with a couple of people. Please don't kill me in the next meetup. So let's see. Well, okay. So Christy, for example, Christiana, she's a Nigerian fellow, and she went through our 2021 inaugural program. So she went through the program, engaged with the task, understood how VCs think and act, and how to be an investor. So she was going through the Launch into VC one. And she used that skill set for her own startup, leveraging that to grow the business, to really set up the business as a venture fundable one, and to secure venture backing. And now she's happily working full-time at her startup. She's now a co-founder and CEO at MyStash. So I think she really evidences that example of someone who maybe came into this to learn about VC, but not just to break into VC. As another example, we have Hamza, for instance, Hamzali. So Hamza came to us from Tanzania. very interesting profile. Is not necessarily someone with a uni degree or even any kind of postgrad education. So he's studied on his own. And he came into the 2022 Launch into VC program. He joined the program really eager to learn and really get the most from our sessions and our network. And I think he really did do that for himself, vastly growing his social capital at the same time. So even before the program ended, a Jim Capital, an up-and-coming early-stage VC fund, offered him and another fellow, Obianuju, VC analyst roles, right? So they even reached out to him, asking him if he was interested for this role, just proving the fact that, the quality and caliber of the individuals can get really high, even just during the process of the program, as he'd come into the program without professional experience before. To give a bit of a different example, we've had someone like Namara, for example, who's a fellow from our 2022 Investor Accelerator program. This is the more substantial 5-month program. So she already joined the program, already being inside the VC space. She'd worked previously with some startups, she'd worked with some accelerators, and she was keen on upskilling herself. So she learned a lot, both on the investment and the so-called platform side of working in VC, which is essentially everything beyond just the investment activity. And this would actually drive multiple funds to chase after her, hoping to bring her in. So we had funds reaching out to us and saying, oh, is she available? Is she hiring? Is she potentially looking for a new role? And she would actually go on to use her skill set to get a promotion at her current fund. And now she's head of ventures at the Baobab Network. So we've had a whole range of individuals, and you can see how even across years, across different programs, we see people from different walks of life. Some who come in with some experience, some who come in with no experience, and others who come in with a lot of experience, but they still get something out of the program. We even have some current and emerging fund managers like Michael, who is leading Africa 3, a Web3 fund. We've had individuals like Lionel, who's now managing director at Ivoire Angels in Côte d'Ivoire. We've had Mercy, for example, from Nigeria, who's running a family office and a trust advisory. So there's a lot going on. And, I can talk about this for a while. I think you can tell. I mean, we get along really well with our fellows, and I'm really proud, and we celebrate each success. So there's a lot of them doing amazing things. And even the ones I haven't had time to mention here, all of them are doing something really, really amazing. And we're really proud of where they are now.
It's clear the Dream VC can turn a dream into a reality. So what tips would you give to someone who has no experience but has a dream about pursuing a career in VC in Africa?
Well, I think my team would kill me if I didn't do a shameless plug. Hit us up. But beyond that, definitely I would say it's a matter of 3 capitals. Not physical capitals, but 3 capitals as in resources you bring to the table. Your knowledge or intellectual capital, your social capital, and your financial capital. If you're somebody who has no VC experience, but you want to pursue a career in VC in Africa, you really need to think about investing in your upskilling. Not upskilling necessarily even just via programs, but upskilling even beyond that. You need to read a lot. You need to follow Substacks. You need to listen to podcasts like this one to stay on top of the market. And I don't just say this because we're here. I say this because this is actually something we really reiterate in all of our programs, and we really try and dig this into our fellows' heads. It's really important. You need to make sure that you're building your connections. Venture capital and the startup space, it's a who you know industry rather than a what you know industry. So make sure that you connect with Dream VC fellows, for example, in different markets, connect with existing fund managers, reach out to startup founders, and always build relationships by giving value first, even if you aren't sure you'll ever need to get something back. Don't imagine it's a quid pro quo relationship, because that sets up a transactional manner. Instead, always approach things by giving someone something if you can provide them value. And then you have that relationship to build on, to maintain, and to grow over time. I think finally, the one thing I will say is, and this is really specifically relevant to working in VC in Africa, is you really need to have a hustler mentality. The idea of sitting in an office in Palo Alto, high on drugs or enjoying your life and investing from a giant briefcase of cash, that's only a reality in Hollywood movies. That is not how venture capital works in real life. Even if you don't have the funds to invest yourself, think outside the box, think how you can help, and think how you can bring a useful skill set to the table. As I mentioned before, VC funds don't have any obligation or even willingness or time to train you. So when you join, if you join a VC fund, an angel network, or support an angel as an individual, you have to come and actually bring your own resources to bear with their teams. So think about what that might be for you and really play to your strength. If you're a lawyer, think about what legal skills that you can bring. If you're someone in the trade space, think about how that can give you an insight on what's going on in cross-border activity. If you're someone who's worked in BD, Think about how you can grow on support sales for the startups that this founder or investor puts their money into. And if you need a hint on where to get started, we actually put together a free VC library on our website. That's literally called VC Library. And you can find book recommendations, blog recommendations, and a list of 130 African VC or startup podcasts that can help you get started. So really, there's resources out there for free waiting for you. So there shouldn't really be any excuse if you have no VC experience, but you want to pursue in the career in VC. Just take the first step and you're already halfway there.
Amazing tips, Mark. I agree 100%. So if we look outside of the current state of VC education and training in Africa and wider, from your perspective, what is your view on the current state of Africa's VC ecosystem?
Well, this again can be a question for a podcast in its own right. But I mean, in short, I'd say it's certainly growing. It's becoming more mature. And I think quickly, it's sometimes through those painful mistakes that angels and VCs are making that they're learning how to act and how to be more intentional. When I say intentional, that means actually following through on a deal, supporting that founder from when you invest to when you potentially sell your stake, being actively involved, thinking out about how you can support them and even operational things. So just getting better at their jobs. I certainly, even as someone who's worked in multiple different VC funds, wouldn't say that, I'm the go-to expert on everything VC. The more you spend time in VC, the more you realize that it's a really, really large space. And there's always some things where there's someone who's better than you. So it's good to realize that and always stay in that learning mentality. But the space is still very nascent, as I said. There's still a lot to do. So hopefully, partially through our efforts, partially through the network of angel networks that are growing all across the continent, supported by ABAN and other network aggregators, partially through government actions and startup-friendly policies, we can slowly build the African VC ecosystem into one that's globally competitive. We're still very far from that at this point.
You mentioned that the space is growing and maturing. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on how it has evolved over the years since you've been involved.
Yeah, sure. And again, our impact on this, while we like to think it's been big, but it's been an impact, but it's certainly not just us at play. There's massive factors and forces beyond us. But the space has evolved massively, right? So annual VC funding, I think, is a good benchmark for us to look at what's going on and who's actually putting money into African startups today. If you go back even 10 years, right? 10 years ago, this was even before I had first started speaking to some of my friends. This is just at the point where we're working together in the US, in the UK, in Europe. Annual VC funding, total funding towards going towards African startups was about $200 million a year. By some estimates, even closer to 100 million. It seems like a lot, but you'll see why that's very important in a second. So 2012, 2013, about $200 million a year. As of last year, we had somewhere between $5 and $6.5 billion being invested in African VC. So we're talking about between a 25x and a 50x increase, right? No investment market anywhere in any continent, anywhere around the world has grown even vaguely comparatively as the growth of annual VC funding in Africa. And that's despite the fact that even as I said today, there are entire African countries with no VC ecosystem who are completely untapped or undiscovered or unsupported by the innovation ecosystem. There are more than 50 times as many VC funds alive today as there were 6 or 7 years ago when I got started. There are many, many more angels than there were ever before. But with some African countries, there's still less than a dozen individuals ever putting in deals. There's no fund and there's little startup support infrastructure. So it's still very, very early nascent evolution stage. And I'm thinking it's going to evolve a lot over the next 10 years. I think the best analogy I can give to some of our listeners is look at India in 2010 and look at India today. Just 10 years ago, India had only $3 or $4 billion companies to talk about. Now there are more than 150 of them.
Oh, wow.
Consider that this is one country. Africa is 54 countries with a larger demographic potential, who's entering the digital space faster, who's adopting technology faster. So what's possible on this continent? I think a lot more.
I agree. So you've detailed the evolution that has taken place in the space. If we look at the current time in terms of now, what current trends in Africa's VC space are you excited about?
What am I excited about? Well, I mean, I'm excited about the growth of the space as a whole. But I think if I had to define something that's actually shaping investor behavior, now let's go in threes. First, more international cross-border connections. I'm starting to see more funds that are realizing that it's not enough to be siloed just in Nigeria or just in Egypt or just in Kenya or just in South Africa or somewhere else. So there are more funds that are more intentionally building international cross-African border connections. For example, opening up an office in Senegal, opening up an office in Cote d'Ivoire, as well as Rwanda, as well as Nigeria and Kenya, a couple of other markets, to better understand the localities and the local challenges and opportunities. So that more internationalized behavior, cross-border connections is definitely a trend that I'm quite excited about. I'm excited about the fact that funds are becoming a bit more serious, which comes with them also increasing their use of technology. It's crazy to think that people are putting hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars of investment into a deal, but they still use pen and paper for notes, and they have no way of tracking deal activity. They don't use CRM systems. They do their accounting in a paper book manner. It's crazy. And thankfully, that's kind of going away. So we're definitely seeing an adoption of more internationally competitive standards, both in terms of fund accounting, fund administration, deal management, and just processing deals faster. Because it's really important. The faster the deals are processed, the faster the founder gets the money. The faster the founder gets the money, the faster they can put it to work, which speaks to an efficient startup investment ecosystem. And in the past, I've seen some funds who take a year or two to make an investment decision when really it should be taking them a month at most. Finally, I'd say there's been a bigger focus on community. I think for me, this is something that I'm really, really, really happy about, because this took more than 40 years to really start to exist in Europe or in the US, where funds started to think, oh, it's not just a money question or a technology question. It's a question of how can we build human, people-to-people, person-to-person relationships that last beyond just that one transaction. How can we build communities of founders? How can we build communities of operators? How can we build communities of investors? And that took a really long time in the US and in the UK and in Europe to really thrive. It's still even not sometimes a thing in some Asian markets, but it's already starting to grow in many African communities. I've seen diaspora communities communicating much more openly with each other. There's loads of Ghanaians and Nigerians, for example, who come together to invest on deals, to collaborate on particular activities. So that's great. And I'm seeing that happen in the African VC space, mirrored by those individuals. So there are more communities of founders and investors that are starting to interact with each other, starting to share information. So slowly but surely, there's a bit more mutual trust. And that's, again, a signal of a more healthy ecosystem in the VC space. So excited to see that too.
Thank you for sharing that, Mark. You detailed what you're excited about and areas that can be optimized to improve the future. So if we look at the future of Africa, where do you see Africa in 5 years' time from an investor perspective?
Well, I hope to see all our initial ambitions achieved, but realistically, I still see probably us facing major infrastructural issues in most African countries, but solidly, unequivocally on the way to solve these. So the success recently of some firms such as Safaricom's M-Pesa, for instance, or the widespread use of MFS Africa, MTN, and other companies, it really speaks to solutions evolving and becoming better, which are solving infrastructural issues of connectivity. Connectivity, energy security, these kind of things are fundamental, not just for the tech sector, not just for innovation, but for the entire economy and society. Right. But energy is just one challenge. Logistics, transport, storage, trade, commerce, healthcare, edtech, you name it. All of these are essentials. They're not luxuries, they are essentials for a market to be successful. And all of these foundations are necessary before we can really talk about consumption-driven markets, data-driven sectors like AI to thrive. So I think now it's really popular to say, GPT-3, GPT-4 is going to be the future. And it might be, but I think, sometimes it's good to also give yourself a reality check and say GPT-3 and GPT-4 are great, but let's first make sure that education is accessible and healthcare is accessible to everyone so people can live to experience. And once we've gone through that, once we have a thriving job sector, once we have a thriving industry sector, let's think about how we can build things faster. It doesn't mean that you need to take a step or learn from Europe or Asia, which did this in 20 or 40 years. Africa is getting through these challenges one hoop at a time, much faster. I can imagine in 5 years, for example, stable internet already covering at least more than half of the continent, which is hard to imagine today, but which is very feasible with 4G, 5G, and satellite internet connectivity coming around. So all of these things, it's positive signals. So I definitely look forward to seeing more funding across all of these logistics and core verticals coming out, and hopefully a general improvement in quality of life, really all across the continent.
I love that answer. You've given an optimistic but pragmatic and realistic picture of the future of Africa from an investor perspective, but I guess from a more holistic overall perspective in terms of how the continent moves forward. If we look closer to home, where do you see yourself, Dream VC, in 5 years' time?
I've always found these 5 years time questions difficult when I was growing up and going for roles. And I thought I put that all behind me.
Me too.
Well, I'd say hopefully by that point, definitely a household name when it comes to investor education, investor capacity building, and more by that point. I don't necessarily know where exactly we're going to go because we have so much going on at any point in time. I mean, literally 100-hour work weeks across our entire team, 52 weeks of the year. So we really have to take it about half a year at a time. It's hard to really predict that far ahead. So definitely ask me in a year's time and we'll have a lot of new projects in the cooker and what to say. But I still imagine us in the space. I imagine us by that point actually being more of a market mover. So potentially even having some influence pushing through some startup-friendly policies, investor-friendly policies, potentially even having some influence that we can have on societies at large. But hopefully still staying true to our core ideal of making the investor space more accessible and much more efficient across the African markets.
Awesome. I mean, you guys have achieved quite a lot in a short space of time. So let's see what the next year, the next 2 or 3 years bring. I'm sure you guys will achieve big things.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
A quote to go by. I'd say, and this is not my words, this is the words of someone before me, a writer who has said this very well, but it's nonetheless very relevant in this context. That the world needs dreamers and the world needs doers. But above all, what the world really needs the most are dreamers that do. And I think that's a great lifestyle approach to have. You really need to dream and you really need to go out there and execute on that dream. And that's how we can build the future we want to see.
Awesome. And I guess it's in line with the Dream VC brand. It's about dreaming and taking action. 100%. Thank you for that, Mark. As we're coming to the close of today's conversation, it's been an amazing conversation. I was hoping you could give us some closing remarks, final calls to action for anyone who is interested in what you do want to find out a bit more. Any final words that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for giving me the platform again, Tessa, and having me on. I'm, as I said, a big fan of podcasts in general, especially the Unlocking Africa podcast. So this is pretty great. I'd say on my end, hopefully this has given our listeners a lot to think about. And we're going to definitely get back to our work of building up a strong and resilient generation of African-focused investors, upskilling individuals, upskilling institutions, upskilling funds to drive forward the African VC world. So I'd really welcome any and all of you who are curious and eager to break into venture capital, to learn more about venture capital in Africa, to check out Dream VC. You can find us at dream-vc.com, and you can sign up your interest for our upcoming programs. These interest forms are available on our website. They're going to be available in the podcast notes. And you can really find out a lot more about us by just reaching out, by finding more about Dream VC online, by finding and speaking to our fellows, or by checking the podcast notes again. So yeah, hopefully this acts as a good resource and a bit of an insight to some of our listeners about the journey we've been on with Dream VC. And this can also inspire one or two of you, or hopefully a lot more, to really consider how every little helps when it comes to the investor ecosystem. And there's a lot more that needs to be done. So all of you can be drivers and change makers in their own end. And we'd love to help you get there.
Awesome. What a way to close today's conversation. That has been an extremely enlightening and educational discussion. It's clear that you're doing some wonderful things that are desperately needed on the continent. I hope today's discussion has inspired some people in or outside of Africa who want to pursue a career in venture capital to take the first step to achieving their dreams. So Mark, once again, thank you for taking the time out to join us on the podcast today, and I'm sure we will speak soon.
Thank you, Tessa. Catch you later.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.